On the morning of February 4th, 1986, a dairy farmer in the outer Sydney suburb of Prospect noticed that his cows had been behaving strangely. For hours, they stood together in one particular spot in the paddock. Finally, when the farmer went to see what they were doing, he came across the brutalized body of 26-year-old nurse Anita Cobby. The case of Anita Cobby would change Australia forever. Anita Cobby was born in Australia on November 2nd, 1959. Growing up, she had told everyone that someday she would be a nurse, just like her mother. It seemed that Anita's calling in life really was to help others, and it was a goal that she would complete. After graduating from high school, Anita had enrolled in a nursing program at Sydney Hospital. There, she met and fell in love with another student named John Cobby. A year later, the couple was married, and by all accounts, it was a pretty modest ceremony, and they really just invited a small group of friends and family. Unfortunately, 3 years into the marriage, the couple separated, but they didn't divorce right away. Instead, they decided to put their marriage on hold. Eventually, the couple realized that they had just been better together, and by the winter of 1986, they were slowly working towards a reconciliation. Although Anita was a dedicated nurse and she really loved her job, as a teenager, she had participated in beauty pageants and won some of them. She really did have a promising career as a model, but the thing about Anita is she didn't care about all of that. She really just wanted to help people. And I think that John saw that in her, and part of him just really loved that about her. At the time of their separation, Anita was living with her parents. And unfortunately, on Sunday, February 2nd, 1986, the couple would never get the chance to mend their marriage. Anita had spent the afternoon at the Sydney hospital working. After her shift, her and a group of coworkers went to a local restaurant to get something to eat. After dinner, she got a lift to the railway station. There, she boarded a train bound for Blacktown, which was a Sydney suburb where her parents' house was located. At around 10 o'clock, she arrived at the Blacktown station, and Anita had planned to call her father and ask him to pick her up. But unfortunately, whether it was bad luck or destiny, Anita found that none of the payphones were in working order that night, and there were no taxis in sight. Anita really had no other option, so she decided to walk home to her parents' house. And although it was dark and later at night, it really was quite a short walk to her parents' home. So Anita would start her walk down a quiet residential street. Unfortunately, she was about to cross paths with the worst type of people. As Anita is walking home down this residential street, it's quiet, it's dark. A car drives up next to her, and in that car is a group of 5 criminals and a car they had just stolen. And these men were quite well known to local authorities. The supposed ringleader of this gang was 19-year-old John Travers. He did have a reputation of being a sexual deviant who took pleasure in torturing and abusing anyone or anything weaker than himself, and that included animals. As these men are joyriding in this car that they have stolen, they realize that they need gas, and none of them had money. So they decided that they needed to rob someone so they could fill the gas tank. In a sick twist of fate, Anita had just rounded the corner as they were passing, and when they laid eyes on her, they knew what they were going to do. The men would pull up beside her, and 2 men would jump out and grab her. Of course, they took her by surprise, but she screamed and she struggled enough that neighbors heard her. A teenage brother and a sister who were living nearby ran from their home just in time to see this group of men forcing this woman into the car. And this boy, who's just a teenager at the time, he starts screaming for them to let her go, and he's running in their direction to try to save her, to try to help her. And I just can't believe the amount of courage that this young man had. I mean, there's 5 men, they're attacking this woman, and he doesn't even think, he just charges at them. And, he wants to help her, he wants to save her. But unfortunately, it didn't help. The men managed to get her in the back seat. They jumped in the car and they sped off. Of course, the teenagers began to chase them, but they gave up because they just couldn't get to them. These men were driving fast. Inside, the sibling's mother was on the phone with police. And during that time, her eldest son had pulled into the driveway. And of course, they filled him in right away about what was happening. So he went out and he searched for this woman who obviously everyone believed was in danger. He would eventually spot a car matching the description he had been given by his family members. The car had been parked on the side of the road in a rural area of Prospect. Of course, he jumped into action. He wanted to, get a hold of this woman before any harm had come to her. So he got out of his vehicle and he started shining a flashlight, but it seemed that they were nowhere to be found. He didn't see any signs of distress, and he assumed that perhaps he had gotten the wrong car. At this point, he really didn't know what to do, so he got back in his car and he went home. This young man who so bravely jumped in his car and went to look for this young woman would later learn that he had found the right car, and those individuals he had been looking for had been lying motionless only a few feet away in the weeds that grew thigh-high around the roadway. They had pinned Anita to the ground with her mouth covered to stifle her screams. At this point, they were certain that nobody was going to come look for them again, so they took her to the nearby field. And in the 90 minutes that followed, the 5 of them had taken turns beating, torturing, and raping this woman. Her attackers would punch her repeatedly. They broke her nose and both cheekbones. They held her down. They raped her repeatedly. And they just continued to sexually and physically abuse her for quite a bit of time. At this point, Anita was laying face down in the grass, and the 5 men decided to discuss what to do with her now. It was then that John Travers looked at everyone and said that she had seen their faces and that it was time for her to die. Of course, the other men encouraged him, so he would grab her by the hair, pull her head back, and slit her throat. He had done so violently that he nearly decapitated the young woman. The men would get up, leave Anita in this quiet, dark, remote location and go back to the car. They would head to John Travers' home and collected Anita's belongings from the car, which included her purse and clothing, and burned them in the backyard. What they didn't know is the next door neighbor had been watching them through a window, and this neighbor would later tell authorities that the items they destroyed had a sickening odor that was like nothing she had ever smelled before. Back home, Anita's parents were beginning to wonder where their daughter was. It had been past 11 o'clock, and they knew that she should have been home quite a few hours ago. But they did know that it was quite normal for her to have a bite to eat with her friends or go out and do something after work. But they were concerned because she didn't call them, and that very much was unlike her. Although her father didn't have any reason to believe that his daughter was in danger, before going to bed, he went to the window one last time to look out to see if she was home yet. He said that as he stared into the darkness, he observed something that sent shivers down his spine. As he's gazing up into the sky, he noticed an odd formation of clouds slowly passing in front of the moon. He said that as he continued to watch, the clouds merged, creating a monstrous-looking face. And in that moment, he knew that something terrible had happened to Anita. Suddenly, he had been overcome by a horrible sense of dread, and he knew his life was never going to be the same. And strangely enough, miles away in Sydney, Lynn Bradshaw, who was a friend and fellow nurse of Anita, said that her sleep was interrupted by a voice she recognized as belonging to Anita. She said that in a dream state, the woman had briefly engaged in small talk before an exhausted Lynn suggested they continue the conversation in the morning when they arrived for their shift. Anita would reply that she wouldn't be returning to work. And the last thing Anita said to her in this dreamlike state was, "I won't be there. I'm dying." She woke to find herself in a cold sweat, and although she lay there in bed and said that, this was just a nightmare, was nothing else, something deep inside of her knew that this had been real. She would look over at her bedside clock and noted that it was just after 11 p.m. Eventually, her friend would learn that Anita's estimated time of death had been between 11 and 11:30. The following day, Anita's parents would receive information that no parents wanted to hear. Their daughter hadn't shown up to work, so of course they went to the police station and filed a missing persons report. When the farmer had called the police, they obviously kind of made the connection, and they identified Anita by her wedding band. Detectives would have focused in on her husband, John. After all, the two of them had been separated and they were kind of working on their marriage, and unfortunately in cases like this, most of the time it is the partner that commits the crime. It appears that they just questioned him so relentlessly that he made a full confession. Eventually, when the physical evidence came to light, it did point to the involvement of multiple people, none of them which was John. So his prior admissions were thrown out and he was cleared of suspicion. It really kind of makes me wonder what these police did to this man. I mean, saying this is her husband, he had nothing to do with the crime, and they managed to get a full confession from him. Apparently, a morning radio host got a hold of a copy of Anita's autopsy report, and they read it live on air. The coroner's findings revealed that her hands and arms were covered in defensive wounds. One of her ears had been severed, her nose and both cheekbones were broken, and she had been raped numerous times by more than one offender. This ignited something in the population. After hearing this, Australia was just upset. They were angry. They wanted to find these perpetrators. After these details were released and they became public knowledge, the leads poured into the police department. And many people mentioned a group of car thieves who were always wreaking havoc on others. And one name in particular had come up time and time again: John Travers. A few weeks after the murders, Travers and his associates would be brought in for questioning, but not in any relation to Anita's murder, but for car theft. John Travers was taken into custody, pending further charges, while the other two were released later that day. After John Travers was arrested, he did phone a relative and asked her to bring him some cigarettes. After delivering those cigarettes, the woman sat and had a conversation with Travers, and by the time she left, she was convinced that he had abducted, raped, and murdered Anita, and she was determined to do the right thing. So she went straight to detectives working the case and told them that John Travers had confessed to the killing and even named his accomplices. So they wired her up and asked her to go have another conversation with Travers. And when the time came, Travers had given her a full account of what occurred on February 2nd. As detectives are listening to this tape, they could hear every so often that Travers would pause and chuckle after some gory details. After he had told her what had happened, he made sure to warn her to keep her mouth shut or the same thing would happen to her. 5 men would eventually be arrested: John Travers, Michael Murphy, Leslie Murphy, Gary Murphy, and Michael Murdoch. On the day of his arrest, Gary Murphy had saw the cop cars coming for him, so he took off running. As he was fleeing from the back door, he was tackled by police officers, and while he was being led away in handcuffs, it was noted that the 28-year-old had wet his pants. Of course, the suspects had quickly turned on each other, but the only thing that they all seemed to agree on was that Travers had been the one to kill Anita. Because there was a tape confession rather than going through the trial, Travers decided to just plead guilty to all charges. What's even more disturbing is during the charges being read against the other men, they all just talked among themselves and laughed at it. Later, the 4 defendants were declared guilty as charged and ordered to spend the rest of their lives behind bars. And it seems that not one of these men ever had shown an ounce of remorse for what they did. In 2019, 66-year-old Michael Murphy had died after a battle with liver cancer. During that same year, his brother Gary was jumped in the shower by a group of inmates, and they beat him. Although he survived, he was sent to the hospital in critical condition. With cases like this, I'm just always so curious how it happened. There's 5 men there, and not one of them decided to stop what was happening. And may I add, 3 of them were brothers: Michael Murphy, Gary Murphy, and Leslie Murphy. And they committed this horrific crime together. It appears that the brothers were from a family of 9 children. Michael Murphy was sent to live with his grandma when he was around 12 years of age. Gary Murphy had a hearing impairment that affected his schooling, so he left school early to seek out work. People noted that he was a very able and willing worker before the crimes, and he had a very strong interest in car, which obviously led him to theft-related charges. And then there's Leslie Murphy, and he was the youngest of the Murphy children, and apparently he had a really awful temper. Even as a child, he faced on numerous occasions theft-related offenses. And Michael Murdoch was a childhood friend and pretty much a criminal associate of John Travers. He would spend part of his childhood in juvenile prisons, and apparently there he experienced sexual assaults. It appears that during his time in, these juvenile prisons, he had written to politicians while imprisoned and asking for protection against such assaults. And John Travers, who was pretty much the ringleader of this gang, was raised in poverty. He was the oldest of 8 children from unmarried teenage parents. And apparently by the age of 14, he was already an alcoholic. He was expelled from high school during his 10th year for being disruptive to the other students. John Travers really couldn't hold a job, so he mostly relied on unemployment benefits. But his mother would commit him to a juvenile detention facility. Eventually, his father would leave the family, and it kind of fell on John to take care of them. So he relied on pretty much stealing to provide food. He would steal animals like ducks and chickens from nearby households. Eventually, his mother's health would deteriorate, and him and his siblings were sent to live with foster families, and she was placed in hospice. But it does appear that John Travers had a history of violent sexual behavior against males and females, as well as bestiality. It was alleged that during those times that he was stealing those birds to feed his family, he had sexually abused the birds prior to butchering and cooking them. Witnesses claim that on several occasions, John Travers had acquired a live lamb or sheep for butchering prior to a barbecue party, alleging that he slit the animals' throats as he sodomized them and abused them sexually. We don't know for sure that that's true, but apparently that is what witnesses have said. Like so many cases this channel has covered, this one is just awful. This young girl was just walking home, trying to get home after a night out, and she rounded the corner and met just absolute evil. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss a video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop in the comments below and I'll be sure to get to it. I'll be back next week with another video, and I'll see you then.